They don't call it a prison, they call it rehabilitation. You get a clean room, 3 meals a day, and counselors who never raise their voices. But every day you stay, you lose a little more of who you were. The Tau don't break you with pain. They break you with kindness. And by the time you realize what's happening, you've already stopped wanting to resist. I remember the day I stopped being a prisoner and became something worse. My name is Arcton Bellis, and I served the God Emperor of mankind aboard the frigate Unbreakable Resolve for 11 years before the battle at Kaidesh took everything I knew and left me breathing in a world that should not exist. The void is cruel, and the Imperium demands sacrifice, but those truths were simple and clean compared to what waited for me after the boarding klaxons stopped and the bulkheads tore open and the enemy came through. I expected execution or torture or conversion into something unrecognizable, some screaming grotesque nailed to a wall as a warning to others. What I received instead was patience. They gave me a room with soft light. They gave me time. They gave me questions I could not answer, and kindness I could not refuse, and silence that grew heavier every day until I could no longer remember why I was supposed to resist. The battle itself lasted 6 hours. Our cruiser escort had been destroyed in the opening salvo, and our captain ordered us into close engagement despite the numerical disadvantage, because retreat would dishonor the throne, and dishonor was a sin worse than death. I remember the way the deck plating vibrated beneath my boots as the plasma drives roared and the targeting servitors chanted their litanies in Beneric monotone. I remember the smell of incense and gun oil and the sharp ozone tang that came before the shields failed. I was stationed at a secondary gunnery bay, feeding ordnance into the macro cannons while the deck shook and the lights flickered and the Vox channels screamed conflicting orders until they went silent all at once. The silence was worse than the noise. It meant the bridge was gone. It meant we were already dead. I felt the boarding craft punch through the hull before I heard it. The impact threw me against the bulkhead hard enough to crack my helmet visor, and when I pushed myself upright, the air tasted like burning metal and something else, something cold and sterile that did not belong in the hot guts of an Imperial warship. My squad leader was shouting for us to form a firing line, but half the crew were already dead or unconscious, and the rest were stumbling through smoke that stung our eyes and made every breath feel like swallowing glass. I pulled my las pistol from its holster and aimed it at the breach, hands shaking not from fear but from the adrenaline that comes when you know you are about to die and your training tells you to die well. The first figure that came through the smoke was not what I expected. It was smaller than a man, wrapped in segmented armor that gleamed dull blue even through the haze, and it moved with a precision that felt wrong, like it was following a script rather than reacting to chaos. Its helmet had no face, only a smooth visor that reflected the emergency lighting in streaks of red and amber. It did not charge, it did not roar. It raised one hand, palm outward, and from somewhere behind it, a voice spoke in flawless low Gothic, calm and measured and entirely free of malice. The voice said we were defeated and resistance would only cause unnecessary suffering. The voice said we would be treated according to the customs of war if we laid down our weapons. The voice said the greater good had no interest in martyrs. I pulled the trigger anyway. My last bolt took the figure in the chest and it staggered back half a step before its armor absorbed the hit and it straightened again as if nothing had happened. My squad leader fired next, then the others, a stuttering volley of las fire that lit the corridor like a strobe and accomplished nothing except to waste power cells. The figure did not return fire. It simply waited. Behind it, more shapes emerged, taller and broader, carrying pulse rifles that hummed with a sound like distant thunder, and still they did not shoot. They waited. The voice spoke again, this time with a faint edge of urgency, explaining that non-compliance would necessitate the use of force, and that such force would be precisely calibrated to minimize casualties but ensure submission. The choice was ours. My squad leader threw down his lasgun first. I do not blame him. The rest of us followed within seconds, dropping our weapons to the deck with a clatter that sounded like the breaking of something sacred. The figures moved forward and surrounded us, efficient and unhurried, and I felt hands guide me to my knees without violence, felt restraints fasten around my wrists with a material that felt like woven silk rather than metal. One of the figures leaned close and spoke directly into my ear. Its voice rendered into Gothic through some internal vox system, and it told me I had made the correct choice and that my cooperation would be rewarded with safety and dignity. I spat in the direction of its visor. It did not react, it simply moved on to the next prisoner. The first hours of captivity were spent in the cargo hold of a Tau transport, a space so clean and brightly lit it felt like a surgical theater compared to the grimy functionality of Imperial ships. We were separated into groups of 10, and each group was assigned a handler, a slim, blue-skinned figure in lightweight robes who introduced themselves with names I could not pronounce, and explained in calm tones that we were being transported to a processing facility where our needs would be assessed and our futures determined. The other prisoners muttered prayers to the Emperor under their breath or sat in sullen silence, but I watched everything, cataloging details the way I had been trained to catalog navigational data. The walls were smooth and seamless, without rivets or welds. The air smelled faintly of something floral, not the incense of a shrine, but something else, something that made my head feel light. The lighting had no flicker, no variance, just a steady white glow that made it impossible to judge the passage of time. Our handler approached me after the first hour and knelt to meet my eyes. They asked my name, and I refused to answer. They asked if I was injured, and I said nothing. They nodded slowly, as if my silence was expected and even understood, and then they said something that has stayed with me ever since. They said that anger was a reasonable response to displacement, and that I would be given time to process my situation before any decisions were required of me. The word they used was displacement, not capture, not defeat, and the distinction felt intentional. I wanted to spit again, but my mouth was too dry. The handler stood and moved on, leaving me with a feeling I did not yet have a name for, a feeling like being seen and dismissed at once. The facility appeared through the viewport as a low sprawl of white structures spread across a rust-colored plain beneath a sky that was too pale, too empty, devoid of the churning void or the familiar constellations I had used to navigate for over a decade. The buildings were arranged in concentric rings connected by covered walkways, and at the center stood a tower that rose just high enough to dominate the landscape without imposing upon it. Nothing about the design suggested fortification. There were no walls, no gun emplacements, no visible defenses except the shimmering outline of a shield dome that flickered like heat haze at the perimeter. The transport descended smoothly and touched down on a landing pad that extended from one of the outer rings. And when the ramp lowered, I felt warm air wash over me, dry and clean, carrying the scent of something growing, something alive. We were led through the facility in single file, our restraints removed as soon as we stepped onto solid ground. I expected cells or cages, barred doors and iron discipline, but instead we were taken through corridors lined with something that looked like frosted glass and soft indirect lighting that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. At intervals, hololithic displays showed images of pastoral landscapes, flowing water, green fields beneath twin suns, images that felt like propaganda but were rendered so beautifully it was difficult not to pause and stare. Our handler walked beside us rather than behind, speaking constantly in that same calm voice, explaining that we were entering the orientation wing where we would remain for 14 days while our health was evaluated and our psychological state assessed. The word psychological state hung in the air like smoke. My assigned quarters were larger than any bunk I had occupied aboard the Resolve. The room measured perhaps 4 meters by 3, with a sleeping platform built into one wall, a small desk and chair beneath a narrow window, and a hygiene alcove screened by a partition. The walls were painted a soft grey blue that reminded me of dawn light on an ocean I had seen once during a brief shore leave on a civilized world whose name I no longer remember. The window looked out onto an interior courtyard where pale green vegetation grew in ordered rows beneath artificial sunlight. There were no bars, there was no lock on the door. I tested the handle, and it opened freely, revealing the corridor beyond where other prisoners were being shown to similar rooms, all of them moving slowly, all of them wearing the same expression of bewildered wariness. A voice spoke from a small grille set into the ceiling, smooth and genderless, welcoming me to the facility and informing me that I would find clothing, bedding, and basic supplies in the storage compartment beneath the sleeping platform. The voice explained that meals would be provided 3 times daily in the communal dining area and that I was free to move through the designated common spaces whenever I wished. The voice said that an orientation counselor would meet with me within the next solar cycle to discuss my transition process. The word transition felt heavier than it should. I sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and stared at the wall and tried to understand what kind of prison gives you freedom of movement and calls your captivity a transition. The first night I did not sleep. I lay on the platform and stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence, a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Aboard the Resolve, there had always been noise, the thrumming of the engines, the distant clang of maintenance crews, the murmur of prayers from the chapel deck, the sounds that told you the ship was alive and you were part of something vast and purposeful. Here there was nothing except the faint whisper of recycled air through the ventilation grill and the occasional footstep in the corridor outside. I tried to pray, but the words felt hollow, stripped of their weight by the softness of the room and the absence of incense and the lack of any icon or aquila to focus my devotion upon. I closed my eyes and tried to picture the Emperor enthroned in gold, but the image slipped away like water through my fingers. The orientation counselor arrived the next morning, announced by a soft chime from the door panel. I had spent the dawn hours pacing the small room, testing the limits of my confinement, and when the door opened I was standing with my back to the window, arms crossed, trying to look defiant. The counselor was Tau, taller than the handler who had accompanied us on the transport, with skin the color of pale sapphire and eyes that were too large and too dark and entirely without malice. They wore simple robes in muted tones and carried a data slate tucked under one arm. They introduced themselves as Chasui Vior, a name that meant something in their language, but which they immediately shortened to Vior for my convenience. They asked if they could sit. I did not answer. They sat anyway, lowering themselves into the chair with a grace that suggested patience rather than submission. Vior began by asking how I had slept. The question was so mundane, so ordinary, that it caught me off guard. I said nothing. Vior nodded and made a notation on their slate, then asked if the room met my needs or if there was anything I required to feel more comfortable. I told them I did not want comfort. I wanted to know what they planned to do with me. Vior set the slate down on the desk and folded their hands in their lap and looked at me with an expression that might have been sympathy if I had been willing to interpret it that way. They said that the facility existed to provide captured Imperial personnel with the opportunity to recontextualize their circumstances and make informed decisions about their future. They said the process was entirely voluntary and that I could refuse participation at any time, though refusal would naturally limit my options. They said the goal was not punishment but integration. I laughed. The sound came out harsher than I intended, sharp and bitter, and Vior waited until I finished before speaking again. They asked what I found amusing. I told them that integration was just another word for betrayal, and that no Imperial citizen would ever willingly serve the enemies of mankind. Vior listened without interruption, their expression unchanging. And when I finished, they asked if I believed the Imperium valued my life, or if I was simply another replaceable component in a vast machine. The question was not rhetorical. They genuinely seemed to want an answer. I said that my value was irrelevant because service to the Emperor gave meaning to existence, and that meaning was worth more than survival. Vior nodded slowly and said that they respected my conviction, but hoped I would remain open to the possibility that meaning could be found in other places. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt designed to erode resistance through sheer normalcy. Each morning I woke to soft light filtering through the window and the smell of something cooking in the communal dining area. Each morning I dressed in the plain grey clothing provided in the storage compartment and made my way through the corridors to join the other prisoners at long tables where food was served on clean trays by Tau drones that moved with silent efficiency. The food itself was simple but adequate. Grain porridge and vegetable stews and protein blocks that tasted faintly of something I could not identify. Nothing like the corpse starch rations aboard the Resolve, but not luxurious either, just sufficient. The other prisoners ate in silence or spoke in low voices about the conditions of their capture, about the ships they had served on, about the homes they would never see again. After the morning meal, we were encouraged to attend various sessions held in different wings of the facility. These sessions were described as optional, but the daily schedule posted in the common areas made it clear that participation was expected. There were physical conditioning exercises conducted in a gymnasium outfitted with equipment that adjusted to individual capability. There were educational lectures on topics ranging from agricultural efficiency to the history of the Tau expansion. There were discussion groups facilitated by counselors like Vior, gatherings where prisoners were invited to share their thoughts and feelings about their circumstances in an environment that was described as safe and non-judgmental. I attended none of these. I spent my days in my room or walking the perimeter of the courtyard, testing the limits of the invisible leash that kept us contained. The courtyard became my refuge because it was the only space that felt even remotely like the outside, even though I knew the sky above was artificial and the plants were cultivated for some purpose I did not understand. I walked the same circuit each day, counting my steps, memorizing the layout, searching for weaknesses or exits that might exist if I looked hard enough. There were benches placed at intervals beneath shade structures, and sometimes other prisoners sat there, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts I could only guess at. One man, older than me, with scars that suggested a lifetime of service, sat on the same bench every afternoon and wept quietly, his shoulders shaking, his hands pressed to his face. I never approached him. I did not know what I could say that would not sound like a lie. Vior continued to visit my room every few days, always polite, always patient, always asking questions that felt designed to peel back layers I did not want exposed. They asked about my family, and I told them I had no family except the crew of the Resolve, and they were dead or scattered. They asked about my duties aboard the ship, and I described the routines of gunnery maintenance and watch rotations with the clinical detachment of someone reciting technical data. They asked what I believed about the Emperor, and I gave them the catechisms I had memorized in youth, the verses about sacrifice and duty, and the eternal vigilance required to hold back the darkness. Vior listened to all of it without judgment, and then asked if those beliefs had brought me peace. I did not answer because the question felt like a trap. The first crack in my certainty came during the third week. I was walking the courtyard when I heard singing, faint and distant, coming from one of the covered walkways that connected the outer ring to the central tower. The melody was unfamiliar, neither Imperial hymn nor any song I had heard in the underhive taverns of my youth, but it carried a strange beauty that made me pause despite myself. I followed the sound and found a small chamber where a group of prisoners sat in a loose circle, their voices blending in harmony, led by a Tau figure who stood at the center with their hands raised in a gesture that suggested both direction and invitation. The prisoners were singing words I did not understand, but their faces were calm, almost serene, and that serenity disturbed me more than anger or despair would have. I turned to leave and found Vior standing behind me, having approached so quietly I had not heard them. They gestured to the chamber and asked if I wanted to join. I said I did not sing. Vior said that was fine. That observation was also a form of participation, and that many prisoners found communal activities helped them process their emotions. I asked what language they were singing in, and Vior said it was Tausia, the common tongue of the Tau Empire, and that the prisoners were learning it as part of their educational curriculum. I asked why prisoners would need to learn the enemy's language, and Vior corrected me gently, saying they were not enemies but individuals in transition, and that language was a bridge to understanding. I walked away before Vior could say anything else. That night I lay awake and thought about the faces of the singers, how relaxed they had looked, how free of the tension that coiled in my chest like wire. I thought about the old man on the bench who wept every afternoon and wondered if he had reached a breaking point I had not yet encountered, or if he was simply weaker than I was. I thought about Vior's questions and the way they never pressed when I refused to answer, never punished my defiance, just made their notations and returned a few days later with new questions that dug a little deeper. I thought about the word transition and how it implied movement from one state to another, as if captivity were a temporary condition and compliance was the natural endpoint. I prayed for strength, but the words felt rote, mechanical, like reciting a technical manual rather than communing with the divine. The second month brought changes to the routine. New prisoners arrived, transferred from other facilities or captured in skirmishes I knew nothing about, and their arrival disrupted the fragile equilibrium that had formed among those of us who had been here longer. The new prisoners were angry, defiant, shouting curses at the handlers and refusing to eat, and barricading themselves in their rooms until the counselors came and spoke to them through the doors, in voices so calm and steady they could have been reading from a weather report. I envied their anger because it was clean and uncomplicated, and I hated that my own anger had dulled into something closer to resignation. I told myself I was biding my time, waiting for an opportunity that would never come. But the truth was I no longer knew what I was waiting for. Vior's visits became less frequent but more focused. They began to ask about specifics, about the doctrine I had been taught, about the stories I had been told regarding the Emperor's divinity and the necessity of the Imperium's cruelty. They asked if I had ever questioned the ethics of serving aboard a warship that bombarded civilian populations or supported ground campaigns that resulted in the deaths of billions. I told them that such questions were irrelevant because the enemies of mankind deserved no mercy and the Emperor's will was absolute. Vior asked if I had ever met the Emperor or spoken to anyone who had, and I said that faith did not require evidence. Vior said that was true, but that faith built on incomplete information was fragile, and that I deserved to have access to all perspectives before committing myself to a single path. They brought me a data slate loaded with files, texts, and recordings and historical analyses that presented the Imperium from perspectives I had never considered. I refused to look at it for days, leaving it on the desk where Vior had placed it, treating it like a live grenade. But curiosity is a slow poison, and eventually I picked it up, telling myself I would only glance at the contents to understand what kind of propaganda they were using. The first file was a recording of an Imperial guardsman describing a penal legion deployment where soldiers were chained together and driven forward into enemy fire by commissars with bolt pistols. The guardsman's voice was flat, exhausted, drained of everything except the need to speak. He said he had believed in the Emperor until he watched children conscripted into the line and shot for cowardice when they froze in terror. He said the Imperium did not care about humanity, only about control. I stopped the recording and put the slate down and stared at the wall for a long time. I told myself the guardsman was lying or broken or had never truly understood the necessity of sacrifice. I told myself that isolated atrocities did not invalidate the greater purpose. I told myself these things, but the voice kept echoing in my mind, flat and certain and terrible in its honesty. I picked up the slate again and opened another file, this one a statistical analysis of Imperial resource allocation, showing how the vast majority of the Imperium's production went to the military and the administratum, while entire hive cities starved and plague ran unchecked through underfunded Medicaid facilities. The numbers were presented without commentary, just raw data, and that lack of rhetoric made them harder to dismiss. Over the following weeks I read more of the files, always telling myself I was studying the enemy's arguments to better refute them, always finding new details that unsettled me. I read about the Tau's integration of multiple species into their empire, how they offered technology and education and autonomy in exchange for cooperation. I read about the Watercaste's diplomatic efforts, their attempts to negotiate with Imperial worlds only to be met with execution squads and orbital bombardment. I read testimonies from former Imperial citizens who described life in Tau settlements, how they had access to medical care and education and opportunities for advancement that the Imperium had never offered. I wanted to dismiss it all as lies, but the sheer volume of documentation, the consistency of the accounts, made dismissal increasingly difficult. Vior noticed the change in me during our next session. They asked if I had examined the materials, and I admitted I had, though I insisted it did not change my fundamental loyalty. Vior asked what loyalty meant to me, and I said it meant keeping faith with those who had kept faith with me. Vior asked who had kept faith with me, specifically, and I found I could not answer, because the crew of the Resolve were dead, and the Imperium, as an institution, had never known my name. Vior let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, and then said that loyalty to an idea was admirable, but that ideas could be examined and revised, and that doing so was not betrayal but growth. I told them I did not want to grow. I wanted to remain who I had been. Vior asked if I was happy with who I had been, and I realized I did not know how to answer that either. The singing sessions in the small chamber became more frequent, or perhaps I simply became more aware of them. I started to linger near the entrance, not quite joining but close enough to hear, and gradually I recognized some of the voices as belonging to prisoners I had seen in the dining hall or the courtyard. One of them was a woman named Kessa who had served as a medicae aboard a transport ship. She had kind eyes and a laugh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and genuine, and she always nodded to me when we passed in the corridors, even though I never acknowledged her. One afternoon she approached me in the courtyard and asked if I wanted to walk with her. I said I preferred solitude. She said that was fine, but that if I ever changed my mind, she would be around. She walked away before I could respond. I found myself thinking about Kessa more than I wanted to admit. She seemed content in a way that felt wrong, as if she had forgotten she was a prisoner or had convinced herself that captivity was acceptable. I watched her during meals, how she spoke easily with the other prisoners and even with the Tau staff, how she smiled when someone made a joke or offered a small kindness. I wanted to hate her for her contentment, but instead I felt something closer to envy. One evening I saw her sitting alone on one of the benches, reading from a data slate, and I approached before I could talk myself out of it. I asked what she was reading. She looked up, surprised but pleased, and said it was a manual on Tau medical techniques, that they had treatment methods for conditions the Imperium considered incurable. She asked if I wanted to sit. I sat. We talked for over an hour, the longest conversation I had with anyone since my capture. Kessa told me about her life before the Navy, growing up in a manufactorum city where air quality was so poor that respiratory disease was considered normal, and where children worked 12-hour shifts by the age of 8. She said she had joined the Medicae Corps because it offered a way off-world and the chance to help people, but that the resources available to Navy Medicae were minimal, and most of her work involved triaging casualties and deciding who was worth saving. She said she had watched people die from infections that could have been prevented with basic antibiotics, from wounds that could have been treated if the supplies had not been diverted to more important campaigns. She said that when the Tau offered her the chance to actually practice medicine instead of just managing death, she had felt relief mixed with guilt. I asked if she felt like a traitor. Kessa considered the question seriously, her expression thoughtful, and then said she did not know if the word traitor applied when the thing you betrayed had never valued you as anything more than a resource. She said the Imperium had taught her that suffering was noble and that self-sacrifice was the highest virtue, but that the Tau had shown her suffering was often preventable and that self-sacrifice was only noble if it achieved something meaningful. She said she was still working through what she believed, but that she felt more human here than she ever had aboard a ship that treated her as disposable. I did not know how to respond to that. We sat in silence until the light faded and the artificial stars appeared in the dome overhead, cold and perfect and wrong. The counseling sessions intensified during the 4th month. Vior began to introduce hypothetical scenarios, asking what I would do if given certain choices, how I would weigh competing values, whether I believed my past actions had been just or simply obedient. The scenarios were never abstract. They were always grounded in specific situations like the ones I might have encountered aboard the Resolve. Questions about firing on civilian transports that might be carrying enemy forces, about following orders that resulted in collateral casualties, about the ethics of the imperial tithe system that stripped worlds of their resources and left populations to starve. I answered defensively at first, insisting that war required hard decisions and that the survival of humanity justified any means. Vior never argued with me directly but would ask follow-up questions that exposed the contradictions in my reasoning. One session stands out. Vior asked if I believed the Emperor would approve of the Imperium's current state, the endless wars and the brutal suppression of its own citizens, and the stagnation that had lasted 10,000 years. I said the Emperor had designed the Imperium and therefore must approve of its functioning. Vior asked if I thought the Emperor, as a being of immense power and intellect, would have intended for his vision to remain unchanged for millennia, or if he might have expected adaptation and growth. I said that speculation about the Emperor's intentions was heresy. Vior asked if refusing to think critically was the same as faith, or if it was simply fear. I stood up and left the room. Vior did not follow me, but I knew they had made their point. I began to attend the educational lectures, telling myself I was gathering intelligence, but knowing deep down I was looking for answers to questions I could no longer suppress. The lectures were taught by Tau scholars, and sometimes by former imperial citizens who had integrated into the Empire, and they covered topics from xenobiology to historical analysis to ethical philosophy. One lecture examined the origins of the imperial cult and the ways it had been systematically constructed by the ecclesiarchy to maintain control over the population through fear and ignorance. The lecturer presented primary sources, documents from the early Imperium that showed the Emperor himself had rejected religious worship and intended a secular, rationalist society. The lecturer asked us to consider what that meant for the validity of the faith we had been raised to accept as absolute truth. I wanted to call it all propaganda, but the sources were verifiable, the arguments were coherent, and the presentation was delivered without the hysterical fervor I associated with heretical preaching. The lecturer did not tell us what to believe, but simply laid out information and invited us to draw our own conclusions. Afterward, during the informal discussion period, I found myself asking questions, challenging points I disagreed with, but also genuinely trying to understand the logic being presented. The lecturer engaged with me respectfully, never dismissing my concerns, and by the end of the session I felt mentally exhausted in a way that was almost satisfying. I had not engaged my mind like that in years, maybe ever. The change happened so gradually, I did not notice it until it was already complete. I started to sleep better, the tension in my body easing as the weeks passed. I started to eat with more appetite, no longer viewing the food as a necessary chore, but actually tasting it and finding flavors I had not noticed before. I started to participate in the communal activities, not fully but in small ways, sitting in on the singing sessions or joining a discussion group or exercising in the gymnasium where the equipment monitored my progress and adjusted to help me improve. I told myself I was just passing time, maintaining my fitness for an escape that would never come. But the truth was, I was no longer thinking about escape. I was thinking about what Kessa had said, about feeling more human here than she had in the Imperium. Vior noticed the shift and began to talk about the next phase of my transition, a word that no longer made me flinch. They explained that prisoners who demonstrated psychological stability and a willingness to integrate could move to a secondary facility where they would receive vocational training and begin contributing to the community. They said the goal was not to make me forget who I had been, but to help me discover who I could become. They said I would have choices about what kind of work I wanted to do, what kind of life I wanted to build, and that those choices would be mine alone. They said that freedom was not just the absence of chains, but the presence of opportunity. I asked what happened to prisoners who refused integration, and Via said they remained in the current facility indefinitely, cared for and safe but limited in their options. The choice was mine. I thought about that choice for weeks. I walked the courtyard and sat in my room and attended the lectures and spoke with Kessa and other prisoners who had made their decisions or were still struggling with theirs. I thought about the resolve and the crew I had served with and the years I had spent believing that sacrifice was the only meaning life could have. I thought about the guardsman's flat voice describing children shot for cowardice and the statistical data on Imperial resource allocation and the primary sources showing the Emperor had never wanted to be worshipped as a god. I thought about all of it until thinking became unbearable, and then I thought some more because that was the only way through. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an admission of something I had known for a long time but had been too afraid to acknowledge. I told Vior I was ready to move to the secondary facility. They asked if I was certain, and I said I was as certain as I could be, which was not the same as being certain but was apparently enough. They made their notation on the slate and said arrangements would be made within the week. They asked how I felt, and I said I did not know. They said that was understandable, and that not knowing was often the first step toward wisdom. I laughed at that, a real laugh. And Vaya smiled in a way that suggested they understood the absurdity of finding wisdom in a prison designed to reshape your entire worldview. The transfer happened on a grey morning when the artificial sky was overcast to simulate weather patterns. I packed the few possessions I had accumulated, mostly clothing and a data slate Vior had given me loaded with educational materials, and I walked through the facility one last time, saying goodbye to Kessa and a few others who had become something like friends. Kessa hugged me, a gesture that felt alien but not unwelcome, and told me she was proud of me even though pride seemed like the wrong emotion for what I was doing. The old man who wept on the bench was there, and he looked at me with eyes that were empty and said nothing. I wondered if he would ever make the choice, or if he would spend the rest of his life sitting on that bench, trapped between who he had been and who he could not bear to become. The secondary facility was larger and less controlled, a campus spread across several kilometers with workshops and residences and communal spaces that felt more like a small city than a prison. I was assigned to a dormitory I would share with 3 other former Imperial personnel, all of them further along in their transitions, all of them employed in various roles that supported the community. One worked in hydroponic agriculture, another in equipment maintenance, the third in childcare for the families of Tau workers stationed at the facility. They welcomed me without judgment and showed me around, explaining the rhythms of the place, the expectations, the freedoms. I asked if there were guards, and they said there were security personnel, but their role was protection rather than confinement. I asked what they were protecting us from, and they said from ourselves, mostly, from the guilt and confusion that sometimes drove people to self-harm. I was given a choice of vocational programs, and I selected technical maintenance because it was closest to what I had done aboard the Resolve, and because I needed something familiar to anchor myself. The training was comprehensive and patient, taught by Tau engineers who treated me as a student rather than a prisoner and who answered my questions without condescension. I learned about systems I had never encountered, technologies that made Imperial engineering look crude by comparison. And I found myself genuinely interested in a way I had not been interested in anything for years. The work was satisfying in a way gunnery maintenance had never been because I was building and repairing rather than preparing tools of destruction. The nightmares came during the first month at the secondary facility. I would wake in the dark with my heart racing and my skin damp with sweat, fragments of dreams clinging to my mind like cobwebs. I dreamed of the Resolve burning, of the crew screaming as bulkheads collapsed, of my hands covered in blood that would not wash away no matter how hard I scrubbed. I dreamed of the Emperor's face, stern and distant, judging me and finding me wanting. I dreamed of my parents, dead since I was a child, telling me I had dishonored their memory. I dreamed of Kessa asking me if I was happy and my inability to answer. The dreams left me hollow and disoriented, and some mornings I could barely bring myself to leave my bunk. The facility had counselors for this, specialists trained in trauma management, and I was assigned to one named An El Xian, who introduced themselves simply as Xian, and who listened to my descriptions of the nightmares without offering platitudes or easy solutions. Xian said that guilt was a natural response to profound change, and that the dreams were my mind's way of processing loss, not just the loss of my former life, but the loss of the certainties that had structured my identity. They said I was grieving, and that grief had no timeline, no correct way to move through it. They said the only way out was through, and that I did not have to walk that path alone. I asked if the nightmares would ever stop, and Xian said they might lessen but would probably never fully disappear, that some wounds leave scars and scars are evidence of survival. I began to talk more openly in the counseling sessions, describing things I had never put into words before. I talked about my childhood in the Underhive, the violence and the hunger and the way people treated each other as obstacles rather than fellow humans. I talked about joining the Navy as a way to escape, how I had believed service to the Emperor would give my life meaning, and how that belief had been the only thing keeping me functional. I talked about the contradictions I had ignored, the brutality I had witnessed and participated in, the cognitive dissonance I had managed by simply not thinking too hard about what I was doing. Xian listened and asked questions and helped me see patterns I had never recognized, ways my past had shaped my present in ways both obvious and subtle. The work became a refuge. I threw myself into the technical training, spending extra hours in the workshops, volunteering for complex repair projects, earning a reputation as someone who could solve problems others found frustrating. The Tau engineers began to trust me with more responsibility, and eventually I was assigned to a team working on maintaining the facility's power distribution network, a role that required both technical skill and the ability to coordinate with multiple departments. I found satisfaction in the work, in the tangible results of effort, in the fact that my labor was creating something useful rather than destroying something distant. I found satisfaction, and that satisfaction brought its own guilt, because how could I feel good about serving the enemy? But the enemy began to feel less like the enemy the longer I stayed. I worked alongside Tau engineers who spoke about their families and their hopes for the future and their frustrations with bureaucratic inefficiencies. All the mundane concerns of ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives. I ate meals with former Imperial personnel who had made the same choice I had, who talked about their past with sadness, but also with a growing sense that they had found something better. I saw Tau children playing in the communal gardens, laughing and chasing each other in games that looked identical to games I had played as a child in the Underhive. I saw all of this, and the propaganda I had been taught, the stories of cruel xenos who enslaved humanity and crushed individuality, began to seem less like truth and more like the kind of lie empires tell to justify endless war. Kessa visited during the 6th month, transferred to the secondary facility after completing her own transition, and we spent an afternoon walking through the gardens and talking about how much had changed. She said she was working in a Medicaid clinic that served both Tau and human populations, and that she had treated more patients in the past 3 months than she had in years aboard the transport ship. She said the difference was that here she had the resources to actually heal people, rather than just stabilizing them long enough to return them to duty. She said she felt like she was finally doing the work she had always wanted to do. I told her I was glad for her, and I meant it, though hearing her talk about her contentment made my own ambivalence feel sharper. She asked if I was happy, and I said I did not know if happiness was the right word. I said I felt useful and engaged and less angry than I had been, but that I also felt like I had betrayed something fundamental, even if I could no longer articulate what that something was. Kessa nodded and said she had felt the same way for a long time, that the guilt was like a weight she carried everywhere, but that eventually she had realized the Imperium had never asked her what she wanted and had never cared whether she was happy or fulfilled or even alive as long as she was useful. She said choosing herself over the Imperium was not betrayal but survival. I wanted to believe her, but belief required a kind of certainty I no longer possessed. The facility began to feel less like a prison and more like a place I simply lived, which was perhaps the most insidious change of all. I woke each morning and followed routines that felt natural, ate meals with people whose company I genuinely enjoyed, worked on projects that gave me a sense of accomplishment, attended lectures and discussions that challenged my thinking in ways I found stimulating rather than threatening. I had freedoms I had never possessed aboard the Resolve, the freedom to choose how I spent my time, to pursue interests that had nothing to do with military function, to express opinions without fear of punishment. I had all of this, and yet I felt like I was losing something essential, even as I could not name what it was. Vior visited occasionally, checking on my progress, asking how I was adjusting, and during one of these visits, I asked them the question that had been gnawing at me for months. I asked if the facility was designed to break prisoners or to rehabilitate them. Vior considered the question carefully and then said it was designed to do neither, that it was designed to offer alternatives and that what prisoners did with those alternatives was entirely up to them. They said the Tau Empire believed that most humans would choose cooperation over conflict if given genuine options, that loyalty built on coercion was fragile while loyalty built on mutual benefit was durable. They said I was proof of that principle, that I had not been broken or forced but had simply been shown a different way of living and had chosen it because it offered something the Imperium never had. I asked what happened to prisoners who never chose integration, who remained defiant until the end. Vior said they were cared for and provided with basic needs but remained in the initial facility indefinitely, that the Tau Empire had no interest in punishing them but also could not release them if they posed a security risk. They said some prisoners spent years in that state, locked in an internal struggle that never resolved, and that it was a kind of tragedy but one the Empire accepted as the cost of treating prisoners humanely. I thought about the old man on the bench, still weeping every afternoon, and wondered if he would ever find peace, or if his defiance would become his prison long after the physical walls ceased to matter. The first time I used the word greater good without irony was during a technical briefing when I was explaining why a particular repair needed to be prioritized for the benefit of the entire facility rather than just our department. The phrase slipped out naturally, and I did not realize what I had said until I saw one of my teammates smile and nod in agreement. I felt a jolt of disorientation, a sense of vertigo as if the ground had shifted beneath me, and I had to excuse myself and step outside to breathe. I stood in the garden and stared at the artificial sky and tried to remember why that phrase had once seemed like heresy, but the reasons felt distant and abstract, like something I had read in a book rather than something I had lived. The realization that followed was worse than any nightmare. I realized that I no longer believed in the Emperor's divinity. I could not pinpoint when the belief had faded, could not identify a single moment of apostasy, but at some point in the slow accumulation of questions and evidence and alternative perspectives, my faith had simply evaporated like water in vacuum. I still remembered the catechisms and the prayers and the rituals, but they no longer carried weight, no longer felt like truth, just felt like artifacts of a past self I could barely recognize. I felt relief at this realization, and the relief terrified me more than anything else, because how could I feel relief at losing the foundation of my entire identity? I confessed this to Xian during our next session, and they asked how it felt to speak the thought aloud. I said it felt like standing at the edge of an abyss, like I had cut the last tether connecting me to who I had been. Xian asked if I wanted to step back from the edge, or if I wanted to see what lay beyond it. I said I did not know, and Xian said that not knowing was acceptable, that I did not need to have all the answers immediately, that transformation was a process, and processes took time. They asked what I did believe now, if not in the Emperor, and I said I believed in work that helped people, and in relationships built on honesty, and in the possibility that life could be more than suffering. Xian said that sounded like a solid foundation for meaning, and I said it did not feel like enough. The final stage of transition came during the 9th month when I was informed that I had been approved for release from the facility. The word release felt absurd because I had not felt imprisoned in months, but the formal change in status came with new freedoms and new responsibilities. I would be relocated to a settlement on a Tau colony world where I would work as a civilian contractor for the Earth caste, maintaining infrastructure and training other humans in technical skills. I would receive a stipend and housing and full access to the colony's amenities. I would be free to travel within certain regions and to build a life according to my own preferences. I would be, in every practical sense, a citizen of the Tau Empire. The offer should have filled me with horror, but instead I felt a kind of numb acceptance. I signed the documents that formalized my status, attended the final round of evaluations to ensure I was psychologically prepared for reintegration, packed my belongings into a single bag that contained everything I owned. Kessa threw a small gathering to celebrate my release, and I sat among people who had become friends and listened to them talk about their own plans and their hopes for the future, and I felt disconnected from it all, like I was watching myself from outside my body. Someone asked if I was excited, and I said I supposed I was, though excitement was not the word I would have chosen. The transport that took me to the colony world was comfortable and fast, the journey taking only a few days through routes I did not recognize and past stars I could not name. I spent most of the trip staring out the viewport at the void, thinking about the years I had spent aboard the Resolve, about the certainty I had once felt, about the man I had been who would have considered death preferable to the path I had chosen. I tried to feel regret, but regret required belief that I had made the wrong choice, and I no longer knew what the right choice would have been. I tried to feel pride, but pride required belief that I had made a brave choice, and I could not shake the sense that I had simply taken the easiest path available. The colony was called Tolku, a mid-sized settlement built around a river delta on a world with breathable atmosphere and moderate climate. The architecture was a blend of Tau design principles and practical adaptations to local conditions, low buildings with wide windows and open courtyards, infrastructure that hummed with quiet efficiency. The population was mixed, Tau and human and several other species I did not recognize, all of them moving through the streets with the casual familiarity of people who belonged. I was assigned housing in a residential district near the industrial quarter, a small apartment with more space and privacy than I had ever known, and I spent the first night sitting on the balcony and watching the sun set over the river and feeling absolutely nothing. The work was exactly as described: technical maintenance and training programs, 8 hours a day with weekends free, and benefits that included healthcare and retirement planning and access to educational resources. My co-workers were friendly and professional and treated me as an equal despite my background. The settlement had libraries and entertainment venues and communal gardens and all the features of a functional society. I attended a few social gatherings, made a few acquaintances, settled into routines that should have felt comfortable but instead felt hollow. I was free and safe and productive and utterly empty. The emptiness persisted for months. I went through the motions of living, doing my job competently, maintaining my apartment, exercising regularly, eating balanced meals, all the behaviors of a well-adjusted individual. But at night, I would stand on the balcony and stare at the stars and wonder who I had become and whether the man I had been would have recognized this version of me or would have seen only a traitor wearing his skin. I thought about the Resolve burning and the crew screaming and the prayers I had stopped saying and the faith I had lost, and I felt nothing except a vague sense that I should feel something but no longer knew how. Xian had warned me this might happen, that the absence of external structure could be disorienting, that freedom without purpose could feel like drifting. They had suggested I find communities or causes that resonated with me, that I build new connections to replace the ones I had severed. I tried. I joined a volunteer organization that provided disaster relief to settlements affected by natural disasters. I attended lectures on topics ranging from engineering to philosophy to xenobiology. I even joined a meditation group that practiced techniques adapted from multiple cultural traditions. None of it filled the void. None of it gave me the sense of meaning I had lost when I stopped believing the Emperor was watching and judging and caring about my choices. One evening I found myself in a bar frequented by former Imperial personnel, humans who had made the same transition I had and who gathered to share stories and support each other through the ongoing process of redefining themselves. I sat in a corner and listened to them talk about their experiences, the guilt and the relief and the confusion, and I realized they were all struggling with the same questions I was. One man, older and scarred, said he sometimes dreamed he was back aboard his ship and woke up disappointed to find himself in a comfortable bed on a peaceful world. A woman with augmetic eyes said she no longer prayed but sometimes caught herself whispering the catechisms when she was stressed. A young man barely out of adolescence said he felt like he had been given a second chance at life but did not know what to do with it. I spoke for the first time in that group, and I said I felt like I had traded one prison for another, that I had escaped the physical and ideological confinement of the Imperium only to find myself trapped in a freedom I did not know how to use. I said I no longer believed in the Emperor but had not found anything to replace that belief, and that the absence felt like a wound that would not heal. I said I was grateful for the safety and the opportunity and the absence of suffering, but that gratitude felt like an obligation rather than a genuine emotion. The others nodded and shared similar feelings, and the acknowledgement that I was not alone in my struggle helped, but only a little. The settlement had a small shrine maintained by the watercaste, a quiet space where individuals from various traditions could come to reflect or meditate or simply sit in silence. I started visiting in the early mornings before work, not to pray because I no longer knew who or what to pray to, but to sit and think and try to process the tangle of emotions I could not articulate. The shrine had no icons or altars, just simple furnishings and windows that looked out onto a garden, and the absence of religious symbolism felt both liberating and terrifying. One morning, a Tao elder who maintained the shrine sat beside me and asked if I needed to talk. I said I did not know what I needed. The elder said that was a good place to start. We talked for over an hour, the elder asking gentle questions and listening without judgment as I tried to explain the dissonance between my past and present, the way I felt guilty for not feeling guilty enough, the way I felt relieved for escaping the Imperium, but ashamed for feeling that relief. The elder said that transformation was always difficult because it required letting go of familiar pain and familiar certainties, and that humans especially struggled with this because the Imperium taught that suffering was virtue and certainty was strength. The elder said the Tao had learned that certainty was an illusion and that accepting uncertainty was the beginning of wisdom. I said I did not feel wise, I felt lost. The elder said that being lost meant I was between destinations and that being between destinations meant I was still moving. I thought about that conversation for days. The idea that I was still moving, still changing, still capable of becoming something I could not yet envision, offered a perspective I had not considered. I had been thinking of my transition as something that should have been completed, a process with a definitive endpoint, but perhaps it was ongoing. Perhaps I would spend the rest of my life negotiating between who I had been and who I was becoming, and that negotiation was not failure but simply the human condition. Perhaps the emptiness I felt was not a void to be filled but a space to be inhabited, a space where I could build meaning piece by piece without the crushing weight of absolute conviction. I started to engage more intentionally with my life in Tulku. I took on more responsibility at work, mentoring new technicians and proposing system improvements that increased efficiency. I deepened my involvement with the disaster relief organization, traveling to settlements that had been hit by storms or floods and helping rebuild infrastructure. I attended cultural events and learned about Tao art and music and literature, finding beauty in forms I had never encountered and appreciating the way they expressed truths that transcended species. I made friends, genuine friends, people I cared about and who cared about me, relationships built on shared interests rather than shared trauma or shared doctrine. Kessa visited during my second year on Tulku, now working at a major medical facility on another colony world. We spent a week together, catching up and exploring the settlement and talking about how far we had both come. She said I seemed more grounded than the last time she had seen me, less haunted by what I had left behind. I said I still struggled, but that the struggle felt less overwhelming, less like drowning and more like swimming against a current. She said that was progress, and I supposed she was right. We talked about the Imperium and what we remembered and what we had learned to forget, and we agreed that neither of us could ever go back even if we wanted to, that the people we had been no longer existed. One night, we got drunk on a local beverage that tasted like fermented fruit, and she asked if I had forgiven myself. I said I did not know what I needed forgiveness for. She said, for surviving, for choosing yourself, for letting go of beliefs that were killing you. I said I was working on it, but that forgiveness felt too simple, too clean, that what I had done was more complicated than right or wrong. She said maybe that was the point, that the Imperium had taught us to think in absolutes, and that learning to live in the grey spaces was its own form of liberation. She said she had forgiven herself not because she believed she had made the right choice, but because she believed she had made the only choice she could live with, and that was enough. The years passed, and the routines became life. I advanced in my career, eventually leading a regional maintenance division that employed dozens of technicians and supported infrastructure across multiple settlements. I developed hobbies, learning to play a stringed instrument that was popular among the human population, and cultivating a small garden on my balcony where I grew herbs and vegetables. I formed romantic attachments that did not last, but taught me things about myself I had not known. I attended the births of children born to friends and the funerals of those who died from age or accident, the full cycle of life in a community that felt increasingly like home. But the question never left me. Late at night, when I could not sleep, or during quiet moments when my mind wandered, I would find myself thinking about the facility and the process that had brought me here, and whether I had truly chosen this path, or whether I had simply been shaped by forces too subtle to resist. I thought about Vior's patient questions, and the educational materials, and the communal activities, and the way the entire system had been designed to make integration feel natural and inevitable. I thought about the other prisoners who had made different choices, and whether their defiance was courage or stubbornness, or simply a different response to the same unwinnable situation. I thought about the Imperium and the brutality I had witnessed, and the lies I had been taught, and the ways I had participated in systems of oppression without questioning, because questioning would have meant confronting uncomfortable truths. I thought about the Emperor, and whether he would approve of what humanity had become in his name, or whether the whole edifice was a betrayal of his original vision. I thought about faith and certainty, and the ways they could be both shield and prison, protecting you from doubt while trapping you in rigidity. I thought about all of it, and reached no conclusions because some questions have no answers, only the ongoing work of living with uncertainty. Xian had been right. The nightmares never fully stopped. They changed form, became less frequent, but occasionally I would wake in the dark with the taste of ash in my mouth and the sound of screaming in my ears, remnants of a past that refused to be fully buried. I learned to sit with those moments, to acknowledge them without letting them define me, to understand that trauma leaves marks that fade but never fully disappear. The scars were evidence I had survived, and survival, I came to understand, was its own kind of victory, even if it felt hollow. On the 10th anniversary of my capture, I visited the shrine and sat in the same spot where I had spoken with the elder years before. The garden outside had matured, the plants fuller and more established, and I watched the light change as the sun moved across the sky, and thought about the decade that had passed and the person I had become. I was not the man who had served aboard the Resolve. I was not the prisoner who had arrived at the facility broken and defiant. I was someone else, someone I still did not fully understand, someone who had learned to live without certainty and to find meaning in work and relationships, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived without constant fear. I thought about the question Kessa had asked, whether I had forgiven myself, and I realized the answer was both yes and no. I had accepted what I had done and the choices I had made. I had stopped punishing myself for surviving and for changing and for letting go of beliefs that would have destroyed me. But forgiveness implied a cleanness, a resolution that I would never feel. I would carry the weight of my past forever, the knowledge of what I had been and what I had done and what I had abandoned. That weight was not punishment. It was simply part of who I was. The elder found me there as the sun was setting, the same elder or perhaps a different one, I could not tell. They sat beside me and asked if I had found what I was looking for. I said I had stopped looking and started living, and that felt like progress. The elder said that was wisdom, or at least the beginning of it. We sat together in comfortable silence as the light faded and the first stars appeared in the sky. Stars that were not the Emperor's distant judgment, but simply lights in the vast, indifferent universe, beautiful and meaningless and enough. I left the shrine as night fell and walked back to my apartment through streets I knew well. Past faces I recognized, through a life I had built piece by piece from the wreckage of everything I had lost. I thought about the Tau facility and the process of transition, and whether it had been rehabilitation or indoctrination or something in between. I thought about the Imperium and its cruelty, and whether cruelty in service of survival was different from cruelty in service of control. I thought about all the questions that had no answers and realized that asking them was more important than finding solutions. I reached my apartment and stood on the balcony one last time, looking out at Tolku spread beneath me, the lights of the settlement twinkling like artificial stars, the river reflecting the moons, the whole scene peaceful and ordinary and utterly alien to the universe I had been born into. I thought about the man I had been who would have chosen death over this life, who would have seen this peace as weakness and this freedom as heresy. I thought about him with something like sympathy, understanding now that his certainty had been armor against a universe too brutal to face without protection. But armor could become a cage if you wore it too long. I did not know if the Tau's mercy was kinder than the Imperium's brutality, or if both were simply different forms of control, systems designed to shape individuals into components that served larger purposes. I did not know if I had been broken or healed or simply changed beyond recognition. I did not know if the man I had become was better or worse than the man I had been, or simply different in ways that defied moral judgment. I did not know any of these things, and I had learned to live with not knowing. What I knew was that I was here. I was alive. I was free to choose how I spent my days and what meaning I assigned to my existence, and whether I wanted to keep moving forward or allow myself to sink into the emptiness that sometimes threatened to consume me. I knew that the choices were mine, and that having choices was both gift and burden, that freedom meant responsibility, and responsibility was exhausting, but also the only thing that made life worth living. I knew these things, and they were enough. The stars above were cold and distant and uncaring, just as they had always been, but their indifference no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like space, room to breathe, room to grow, room to become something I could not yet imagine. I stood on the balcony and watched the night deepen and felt the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future and the fragile present where I existed between them, and I thought that perhaps this was what it meant to be human, to carry contradictions and live with ambiguity, and find meaning not in absolute truths, but in the ongoing work of being alive. I went inside and closed the door and prepared for sleep, knowing the nightmares might come, but that I would wake again and continue the process of living, and that continuation was its own form of defiance against both the Imperium that had wanted me to die for it and the Tau who had wanted me to be remade in their image. I was neither martyr nor convert, but something messier and more complicated, a person who had survived by changing and who had changed by surviving, and that messy, complicated survival was mine. The last thought I had before sleep took me was that the facility had not broken me and had not saved me, but had simply offered me a choice I should have always had, the choice to question and to change and to live without the crushing weight of certainty. Whether that choice had been manipulation or liberation, I would never know, but I had made it, and it had brought me here, and here was a place where I could breathe and think and exist without constant terror. That was not happiness. That was not redemption. That was simply life, and after everything I had been through, simply living felt like more than I had any right to expect.